Welcome, friend. Dr. Grant Wiedenfeld here in the weeds, trying to understand Mweze Ngangura's African cinema, militancy, or entertainment. Let me give some background on the writer. He's also a filmmaker and the context he's writing in, and then we'll overview the text. So, Mweze Ngangura, born in 1950. He was born in what was at the time the Belgian Congo. 1950 was a colony. Today is the Democratic Republic of the Congo. He's from the east, right next to Rwanda and Burundi there in Bukavu. Of course, he went to he said of his background that he received somewhat of a Jesuit education. So like French Jesuit, monks, priests who knew about the cinema. And he ended up going to film school then in Belgium, Brussels, I assume, and then came back and became one of the film Congolese filmmakers to receive that kind of education. Came back to Kinshasa, the capital, where he was, film and TV professor at a couple institutes in the 70s. Really started to make documentary films in the 80s, and also had some fiction films. The country he's from, DRC, Democratic Republic of the Congo, is the second biggest country in Africa. Became independent from Belgium in 1960. There's kind of a civil war strife until 65. There's another period of war after Mobutu. There was Mobutu, who was kind of a dictator figure supported by the U.S. government, renamed the country Zaire, and then it becomes Congo again after he falls in the late 90s, and there's also strife around that time, tied in with Rwanda. So that's how you may know about it from history. Obviously, the Congo River is the biggest feature of it, and very diverse place. Lots of different kinds of people in Central Africa here. Okay. One thing that comes up in the text, and thinking about African cinema in general, is this festival, FESPACO, which is French for the Pan-African Film and Television Festival of how do you say this? Ouagadougou, which is in Burkina Faso. And in Ngangura, his film Pièce d'identité, like Identity Pieces or Pieces of Identity, won the best film there in 1999. It's biennial, every 2 years, established in the 1960s. So it's a key kind of site for African cinema. And that kind of festival of African cinema and his filmmaking and these themes are useful to think about in the context of Pan-Africanism and Négritude. Pan-Africanism, kind of a broader movement of solidarity and in the Cold War became more focused around kind of the different nations in Africa having solidarity among themselves rather than choosing sides in the Cold War. It was tied in with this kind of third world, non-aligned movement that they should put their own priorities first. Because a lot of Africa, which had been colonized in the 19th century especially, was decolonizing at this time and becoming independent. So the idea is that if these countries stick together, they'll be more successful in their independence, kind of an idea of confederation. And part of that confederation and that common African spirit is through culture and events like FESPACO. The theme that also comes up is a sense of development, that Africa has not been developed as much as Europe or North America. And so, how can Africa develop is going to be a theme, and the role that cinema plays in that. Negritude movement really starts centered in Paris, 1930s, with Black students, writers, intellectuals in Paris they're from different countries that were French colonies or somehow related to France. And like many places, the people go to the capital city that's where the best schools are. So students from all over the place there and intellectuals, they start concentrating on this ideas of Black consciousness and the kind of the nature of Blackness and the relationship to Africa that ties them together, even though they're not in Africa at the time. In the same way that when you go abroad, oftentimes that's where you bond with somebody else who's from your home state. Say you're from Texas. If you're traveling in some faraway land and you come across somebody else who has a Whataburger thing on, you say, "Oh my gosh, you're a Texan." So in a much deeper sense, negritude is trying to understand what Blackness is all about and bringing consciousness of Blackness, really to the whole diaspora and back into Africa itself. They're in dialogue with the Harlem Renaissance in New York City. They're reading the Harlem Renaissance. I think the Harlem Renaissance people are reading Negritude. A lot of these Negritude writers, actually two women were the key ones who started it, Paulette and Jean Nardal. There's from Martinique, from the Caribbean, Aimé Césaire, also from the Caribbean, some West Africans like Sadji and Léopold Senghor. Senghor is a writer who went and became the first president of Senegal, and then Damas in Guyana. This is a painting by Nigerian Ben Nwanwu, entitled Negritude. It was also, kind of on the periphery of this, really influenced by Negritude. Okay, so that context is important for thinking about, okay, how are we going to develop Africa? This is the same kind of context that we saw, there are Latin American filmmakers and film theorists who are thinking about third cinema in this way. And their idea is the way to develop, the way to decolonize and to develop the global South is through third cinema, this kind of guerrilla cinema. You need to have this revolution. They don't believe in the culture industry or our film circuit. And there are a lot of African filmmakers who share similar views, who are into this kind of guerrilla cinema, militant cinema. And this is where Ngangura comes in. And he takes quite a different position. And he says, no. What Africa really needs and doesn't have is effectively that first cinema. It needs an entertainment cinema, but an African one, not an imported one. So let's dive in and look at a couple of things that he says here. Now, this must have been written in 1989, between 1989 and 1991, because he says the last Fescapo was in 89, so the next one I think was in 91. I'm just speculating here, but it was translated for this anthology in 1996. And okay, so there's this theme of development, and I love this part in the second paragraph here. It says, okay, the crisis in Africa is not going to be overcome by just economic growth and changes of political regimes. That is, there are places that are growing and making money. There is, new political regimes that have come in, but the development is, in his view, still not enough. And for him, one of the missing ingredients is culture. That there isn't a strong sense of African culture that would be important for this development as an independent nation states here. Um, so this idea of why culture would be important to that, development, he mentions here in the next paragraph. Uh, if we take the term culture in its broader meaning as the manifestation in everyday life of the cohesion and the dynamism of a collective, it becomes evident that the cultural activity most likely to contribute to Africa's development is pop culture of mass culture. Okay, so the idea here is that the cohesion, what holds people together, and dynamism, their movement, their ability to change, and development is a process of change, that is coming through pop culture. So, as opposed to Adorno, who sees pop culture as this conservative thing that's always keeping the status quo, the culture industry rather, in Ngangura here, he actually sees positives, a potential for progress and development in pop culture. And so if we jump down to the next paragraph, now he's saying, what kind of pop culture is it going to be? Well, he's going to argue against didactic films. Didactic is another word for teaching. So films that try to teach a lesson or teach something. He thinks entertainment is that kind of special sauce that that energy that is going to hold people together, hold African peoples together, and that's what they're missing right now. So he has an extremely well organized article here. It's surprising for a creative filmmaker. It feels much less kind of the wild manifesto of third cinema. It's also interested in the collective, but for it, the collective, has to be focused on economic and being anti-capitalist. Here, the economics is set aside. It's the focus is on this, this dynamism. He's going to get a little bit more into what that means later here. First, he's going to start out with what it's not going to be. It's not going to be teaching a lesson. Why is that? Well, in his view here, he says that film language is more emotional than intellectual. Up at the top, he says, the problem with didactic films is you don't know how people are going to take the message. Look at these messages, like a propaganda movie like Reefer Madness. There's some Senegalese one. He doesn't cite the names, so I couldn't find it, but it was supposed to convince people. The message was don't smoke marijuana. Well, it kind of had the opposite effect. It became, all cannabis users, hippies in the 70s. Well, they love this movie. So he shows that as a problem with the didactic films. It's better for the way films work is that they're based in emotions. That film language is as complex as life itself, and perception is more emotional than intellectual. He talks about dramatic structure being key. So he wants drama, not intellectual messages. And this makes sense for pop culture, right? Another problem with having a message film is going to get banned because it's inevitably going to be at odds with the government. If the filmmakers are independent artists, they're not just doing what the state tells them. The third problem is that didactic movies don't make money. So they're going to have to get supported by some organizations. But if some sort of organizations are supporting them, well, then they're not really independent anymore. And then it starts to feel like, this kind of handout thing, almost like a charity cinema. And how could African people be proud of this charity cinema that other people have to fund that can't make money on its own? So this is why he wants popular movies that people want to pay to go see. That's independent. It has its own life. Okay, couple other reasons here. Fourth, in a word, he says that they already have second cinema and third cinema in Africa. They already have the cinema d'auteur, the author films, European art film style, because this is what what the first African filmmakers were making. They often went to film school in France or Belgium, like he did, and they're making art films. So that they already have this in Africa, and this is not what the audience wants. Down at the bottom, he says, these kinds of films have only succeeded in alienating the African cinema from the African audience from its own cinema. So it has like a double negative effect. You show them these art films and didactic documentaries, militant documentaries, and hold up the banner and say, "Oh, this is African cinema," and then the audience, they're just they just want to be entertained. They see this and they're like, "This is African cinema. Ugh, I hate African cinema. I don't feel good about Africa then." So it's the sense of making something that Africans broadly are going to be interested in and proud of. So kind of extending this idea that militant cinema, he says, is actually European. He says he shows that African cinema was born in Europe. Now, this is because all of the technology around cinema was developed in Europe. So naturally, the first African filmmakers are ones who were there around the centers of filmmaking, in the same way that Paris and Hollywood and New York, these are London, these are centers of filmmaking, and so whoever's there is making films first. And in similar to Négritude, here in the 50s, there are Black students and intellectuals, many of them from African colonies or former colonies who were in Paris, or just maybe their families had immigrated to Paris long ago. And so this famous first film, Afrique sur Seine, which means Africa on the Seine River, or Africa in Paris, as a short documentary of African French everyday life, made by some filmmakers born in Senegal. Okay, so Ngangura's point is that these art films, militant films, are more European in style, really. And he says they, not only they're European in style, but this maybe is a form of colonialism, because he compares French to British colonialism down here. He says British colonialism, they always focus on business. French colonialism, it focuses on culture, and kind of teaching French culture to the colonized people. So this is a little dig here at the militant filmmakers who say, "Oh, we're being anti-European by being militant." And Ngangura flips it around and says, "Well, isn't being militant a European idea?" So it's a nice counter argument that he develops here. Okay. Now comes to the next question. This leaves the question of entertainment cinema and under what conditions it could play a positive role in the development of Africa. How could entertainment cinema be good? What are the grounds for it? Okay. I love this little anecdote that he starts with. Talks about being at the Ouagadougou Festival in '89, the last one he was at. A boy of 13 years of age came and asked, "Why did we not make a film with an African Rambo?" The kid said, "I really would like to see an African Rambo in the cinema." Now, if you're not familiar, this is a reference to the 1985 Sylvester Stallone movie, Rambo. They sent him on a mission and set him up to fail, but they made one mistake. They forgot they were dealing with Rambo. Oh, I love the little tagline here. no man, no law, no war can stop him. It is, the highest grossing movie in Hollywood in 1985. Also, very much trashy kind of culture industry that Adorno would call it. Critics called it also this kind of fascist fantasy of vigilante vengeance in Vietnam. This kind of American goes back to Vietnam to rescue the POWs and kind of massacres everybody there. So it's a real revenge fantasy for U.S. audiences after having lost in Vietnam, or that's one element of it anyhow. Okay, so kind of wild in a way. It feels like a very colonial film. The decolonists or the Vietnamese. They should be the heroes, but in Rambo, of course, it's the white American who's the hero. So then he asked the question down at the bottom. Why is this African boy? Why, and other African spectators, why do they consume Rambo of all things? And he gives a couple of reasons. He says when they go to the movies, they want to be entertained, they want to be distracted, and there aren't enough African films to distract them, so they end up, looking at these kind of trashy American movies. Hence, if they made African films, then they would probably watch those instead. And one of the problems here, with there not being African entertainment films, is that kind of U.S., European ideology of colonial domination, that if you believe that ideology is in this film, and there's good reason to believe that it has some kind of colonial messages in it, white savior type of tropes, that the African audiences, they're going to be consuming these colonialist messages that, in the way colonialism works, this would make you feel bad about being black. If you see movies where you don't have any other black heroes in them. So the way to correct it is not militant cinema for Ngangura. It's to make positive entertainment films that will get Rambo out of the way. Now, other interesting point: why does the boy look for this kind of Rambo figure? Well, this is a simple idea of drama, and that spectators want to identify with the heroes, and that he explains more that in identifying with them, they're looking for a model, an ideal for, what does he say, physical, moral, or intellectual characteristics, positive heroes that are going to model these values. And the reason the boy came up and asked, why don't you make an African Rambo? Because he wasn't satisfied with the American Rambo. He wants an African Rambo. He can't totally identify with the Stallone character. So looking for a positive, kind of African images here. So this is a little summary in the middle. So these 3 points: necessary conditions for reconciling the African audience with its own cinema. Entertaining films. African heroes embodying totally positive social values. A familiar cultural context. All right. So this is what he's calling for. What are the dangers out there? Well, he lists a couple dangers that filmmakers who want to do this are going to run into. He says, inevitably there's its relationship with the state and political power. And, one line would say, well, you're going to have to do whatever the state, whatever the people with money want you to do. And his counter argument here is to say, well, if you become a really successful filmmaker, then you kind of have stature to do a lot and to push back against the government. In the sense that, somebody as big as, a Steven Spielberg can or a James Cameron, like with Avatar. He can he doesn't have to worry about um, pleasing or not pleasing some government, because his films are so popular that they have a power of in and of themselves, which is related to thinking of power as the gathering of people. Is an idea from Hannah Arendt, that power is the potential created by gathering people. The authority that's held by the state is something else. All right, let me jump onto this. Second danger there is to focus just on sex and violence, as opposed to these kind of base instincts, as opposed to the real popular cinema has a soul to it. He says, there's commercial cinema that's just about money, and then there's popular cinema. There's some heart and soul. There's this might be an example of the succumbing to sex and violence. I don't know. It would be Wakaliwood. There's a filmmaker in kind of a slum in Uganda, Kampala, makes these really violent action movies. They're terrible in some ways, really bad, campy movies, but sort of the African Rambo idea without the heart and soul. If you want to watch it and tell me that it has great soul, you can convince me. But check it out. Who Killed Captain Alex? So I don't think Captain Alex is the African Rambo that he's looking for, because it's mainly just focused on violence. Okay, and there's a third danger here, and that's stereotypes and cliches of Africa and African peoples that have been around for a long time. They've been passed down, and people have learned them from the American and European cinemas that they watch. So how can we avoid doing those again? One of the things that he points out is the tendency in recent African cinema to present a mythical Africa outside any geographical or historical context, which he says could engender some confusion in the spectator's mind. I'm thinking of Cissé here as maybe the filmmaker he has in mind. And just speculating here, the idea of a timeless Africa, this falls back on the cliches of primitivism, of Africa as a place without history, of people living in this primitive state where it hasn't changed life hasn't changed for millennia. It's totally underdeveloped. Well, this is not going to help development to think of Africa as totally primitive. So he's pointing towards there having some kind of historical background and something specific about where this is set, more realistic, in words. So we may say, oh, Black Panther, this is the African Rambo that he wanted. He wrote this in the 90s. This came out 20 years later. I'm not sure for this reason here, and that it's fantasy, it's sci-fi, and I've seen it in interviews with Ngangura, saying that he's more realist than into fantasy, and I think this is the reason why. Now, I'm not sure Black Panther is. I'm not going to come out and say that it's playing into those primitivist kind of tropes entirely, but I think that's maybe one issue that Ngangura might take with it, and why he might prefer a movie like The Woman King, which has a specific setting in the Dahomey Kingdom, modern day Benin, in the 1820s, about this all-woman warrior unit that protects the king. So having that kind of historical grounding for these positive images also gives a very positive image of Africa's past. Even if the development didn't follow the same timeline as Europe, there was development there. There was history, and having a consciousness of that, I think, is important for him. Also reminds me of Aristotle, who prefers history to fantasy. So lastly, he concludes by saying that, he quotes a banner from the '87 festival: "Africa thirsts to see its own images." The urgent need is not to make movies that speak of Africa, hence didactic. We don't want to be talking about Africa, but films for Africans. So for his idea is the most pressing need is that kind of first cinema and entertainment cinema that African people are going to be proud of. As I conclude, let me just, raise one kind of question that might ask is that, well, one might say, isn't a positive hero who's modeling, these values, isn't that a form of didacticism too? And that's really what the art films, cinema d'auteur, and Militant is pushing back against, is the relationship of viewers that are supposed to, just learn messages straight from the movie. This is, Adorno talks about this being conformism. So there's that problem, which I'm not sure Ngangura quite addresses, except to say that conforming to an Africanism would be good, because as opposed to conforming to some sort of European value, that maybe that is a necessary basis, and then afterward, then you can have this kind of higher, critique of that conformism. And one might also say that, history films are more didactic than fantasy. So this sense of wanting it to be a cinema of entertainment, but then also, not wanting it to be kind of a mythical Africa that's not based anywhere. That's a we start to walk a tightrope there. That sounds like, his idea would be fantasy heroes within real context, real historical context. So in a word, that is, his vision of the African Rambo, and what he thinks, why he thinks an entertainment cinema will be important for, the development of African culture and the development of Africa overall.